In this episode, I have got James Cridland in the studio with me to break down some of the biggest changes that are shaking up the podcasting industry as we speak. Because as the editor-in-chief of the industry's leading daily newsletter, Podnews, and the co-host of the Podnews Daily podcast, James has his finger on the pulse of what was, what is no longer, and what is to come inside of the industry. So whether you are just starting out as a podcast host or whether you have been podcasting for years, James will share some key insights on what these shifts mean for your show and how to navigate them so you can stay ahead. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. James, welcome to the show. I am delighted that you are here today. Thank you so much for making the time.
Oh, it's great to be here.
You have had such an extensive career in broadcasting. For those that are not familiar with who you are and what you do, you run Podnews now, a daily news outlet for the podcasting industry specifically. And, in your background, you've worked with the BBC, you've worked with Virgin Radio. And I'm curious, as we begin to jump into this conversation, really, how has that experience shaped your perspective on podcasting?
Oh, I've always loved audio. I've always thought that audio is a really interesting medium. It's a really interesting tool to use. Yeah. And I think, that both radio has a lot to teach podcasting, but also podcasting, goodness, has a lot to teach radio as well.
What do you see the influences of one on the other?
Well, I think podcasting wouldn't sound like it does without radio existing and radio going for just over 100 years now. So, there are clearly cues that all podcasters take from the audio that they've grown up with. But I think also, podcasting is so different. I was telling somebody the other day that if you are starting a brand new radio show, you still have an audience. You've got an audience of the previous person that was on, or the person that was on before the news at the top of the hour, or something. You've got an audience which you can grow with. If you're starting a podcasting, you have zero. You have a zero audience. And so it's a very, very different experience. Of course, the other big difference with radio and podcasting is that with radio, you can start listening at any time. With podcasting, you start listening at the beginning. So you don't have to constantly remind people who you are and what the name of the radio station is or what the name of the podcast is, which is lovely, which means that podcasting can be so much more natural than all of a sudden having to stop and say, so I'm talking with Courtney. And, none of that really works. So it's a wonderful tool.
It is interesting to note the differences. Having done radio interviews and having been podcasting for a long time, there is a different context. Yet, at the same time, it's easy to see how one can influence the other and how that changes generation to generation. My 6-year-old this morning has one of those crank radios and he's cranking it and he's like, oh, listen to this, Mom. And it's a song. And then, he changes the station and it's now talking. And we were having to explain to him what radio is. And my husband was like, you can't just listen to anything you want. You have to listen to what's playing. And if you don't like what's playing, you change the station. He's like trying to wrap his mind around this concept. This is something, too, that I think is so unique about the podcasting industry. We all know the intimacy that it creates between the listener and the host. And you're someone who's been at the forefront of reporting on podcasting trends in the industry. I'm curious for early stage podcasters right now. As the landscape continues to change and evolve, what would you say are some of the key things that new podcasters should be paying attention to in today's landscape?
Oh, there are so many, but I think one of the first things that I would say is it is still absolutely the right time to start podcasting. There are so many people starting new shows, and you might think, oh my goodness, there's so much competition out there. There's really not that much competition. Yes, there might be over 4 million podcasts now. But if you have a look at how many are being updated right now, being updated over the last month, it's about 300,000, which is a far, far smaller number. And that's really your competition. Most people will listen to podcasts that came out over the last week. Most people won't go back, although you can. Most people won't go back and find a podcast that went out 3-4 years ago. So therefore, actually, there is very little competition in many ways. And the beauty about podcasting, unlike broadcast radio, is that you don't have to be for everyone out there. You can really focus on what I call a niche, what you'll probably call a niche, but you can really focus on just, really super serving a small audience and an audience who is just really keen to learn what you have, to actually say. So that's a big, big difference in comparison to if you have an FM frequency, you want to make sure that as many people are using that FM frequency as you possibly can. Podcasting doesn't work that way. And podcasting is a great place for really tight, closely knit communities of audiences who just really want as much information as they possibly can on a tiny subject. So I think there's real opportunity there. Yeah.
I've definitely seen the emergence and the rise of more niche podcasts here, especially over the last several years. I'm curious, James, for those podcasters that do have a niche podcast or a niche podcast, how would they need to be comparing their podcast to bigger shows? Because this is something that comes up a lot. And it's very easy to look at a smaller niche podcast and say, well, this is not the same as, Joe Rogan. It's obvious. Yet at the same time, the tendency is there to say, well, I'm not as big yet as someone like a Joe Rogan. Is it possible for those shows to grow as big? If not, then what are some of the benchmarks that you really recommend people looking at and leaning into to really do away with this comparison? Because as I'm sure you would agree, in the industry, we see that there's really no apples to apples in the podcasting space.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's very easy for us to look at the Joe Rogan numbers and to go, I mean, he gets, if you listen to what some of the press is, he'll get somewhere in the region of 2 or 3 million downloads per episode. And you're there going, oh my goodness, I'll never be as big as that. And you look at your own and you're doing 70 or 80 downloads and you think this is a dreadful thing. I tell you what, if you're doing 70 or 80 downloads per episode, you are doing better than half of the podcasts out there. It's a fascinating thing having a look at all of the different numbers. And there's a bunch of different benchmarks that you can take a look at. One easy place to take a quick peek is the Buzzsprout podcast hosting platform. They have some stats on the podcasts on their platform, which you can see at buzzsprout.com/stats. And right at the bottom of that page is how people are doing in terms of downloads and how a typical average podcast on that platform is doing. And it will make you feel a whole lot better than reading all of those press stories about Joe Rogan and his 2 million downloads per episode. That's one place to have a look at. Another place to have a look at is a website that I actually work on, which is the Podcast Business Journal. And if you go to podcastbusinessjournal.com/data, then you'll find, again, benchmarks, a bunch of individual download numbers for shows in your category. So if you have a religious show or if you have an educational show, whatever category your show is in, you'll be able to see 10, 15, 20 different shows in that category. And you can actually go, oh, okay, this is where I am in this particular list. So, there's lots of open data. And I think that's the exciting thing about podcasting is that we're still a relatively new medium. We've been going for just over 20 years. And all of us want to help everybody else in the industry move on and to help grow the industry. Podcasting, if you look at the total amount of audio that we put into our ears, podcasting is only 10% in the US, 6% in the UK. We've got so much to grow. Which is a wonderful thing. And so therefore, all of the industry is very much wanting everyone to succeed. And by sharing data and by sharing information, then that's a super good way of doing that.
That is something I'm very much looking forward to as the landscape evolves, is just more transparency in the data. We will definitely link to those links that you mentioned in the show notes because it can be very fascinating to sit there and actually see, okay, first of all, how do I stack up in reality? Second of all, what are other podcast shows doing that are in my niche or that are maybe adjacent shows to mine and specifically in my category? Something else, James, that is particularly fascinating about you is that you've also had some experience in helping established podcasters sell their shows. And the reason I find this so interesting is because even for those listening right now who never plan to sell their podcast, this is something that they plan to keep, they want to make an impact with it. I would imagine that some of the things that go into creating a sellable podcast are also important for those of us looking to grow a podcast. So from your experience in that, how would we need to then look at our podcast or think about our podcast to build a show that can carry that kind of value in the long run?
Yeah, there's a organization that I'm involved with called the Podcast Broker, which helps take a show. Maybe you can't do that show anymore. Maybe, life has changed and you don't have the time, and it will actually help you work out whether that show can be sold on, whether there are other people who are interested in that. And I think really there are two things there. There is consistency, making sure that you are consistently there. Podcasting is a habit forming medium, much like radio is. There's a podcast that I listen to when I'm doing the supermarket shop on a Saturday. There's a podcast that I listen to when I'm walking the dog in the morning. There's a podcast that I listen to when I'm doing other things over the weekend. It's a very much habitual thing. So making sure that you are there at the same time every week if you're a weekly show, so that people know to expect you and people can actually build their lives around your show. That's certainly one thing. And the other thing is, and it goes back to what we were saying, slightly earlier, making sure that your podcast is for someone. If your podcast is for everybody out there, then it's probably not actually going to be that valuable, because guess what? Joe Rogan is for everybody who's out there. The real benefit and the real value in a podcast is looking at a community of, people that really enjoy knitting cardigans underwater. And you have the number one knitting cardigans underwater show for that community. That is an incredibly valuable thing for sellers of waterproof wool, and for other things. That's an incredibly valuable thing. And so therefore, making sure that your show is aimed at someone, aimed at a particular community, is a super important thing in terms of keeping its value high.
Underwater cardigans, that sounds like blue ocean right there to me, James. I don't know if anyone's
That's
listening to this right now. If there's not a podcast yet on that, you may want to go jump on that, because that is as niche as it gets. I'm curious too, for those that are listening to this right now, James, and who are new to the space, or who might not have their podcast yet. You've mentioned some things they need to be thinking about. And for those existing podcasters now too, that are trying to grow their shows, looking back, what are some strategies that you would say are not working anymore, that maybe used to work, but that aren't working as well anymore to the same degree that they did? And what now do you recommend instead, given where the industry is shifting as we move ahead?
What people used to do in the past is just put a show out and people would, find it because there weren't that many shows, and people would start listening and away you go. This time around, you have to work quite hard now, because there are very many more shows. And actually, a typical person listens to 2, maybe 3 podcasts a week. So therefore, you are asking a big favor of them. If they're going to start listening to your show, that probably means they're going to have to stop listening to another one of their podcasts. So they need a really good reason to listen to your particular podcast. And that means that you need to get a bit of marketing right. You need to understand what your podcast is there for. Eric Newsom, who's written a great book called Make Noise. Eric talks about the 10 words that your podcast is about. Can you explain in 10 words or less, or 10 words or fewer, if we're going to be correct in terms of the language? Can you explain in 10 words or fewer what your podcast is about in a really succinct way? And if you can't do that, then that's probably something that you need to focus on, now. And then work with people to help amplify your message, to help get it into maybe the social media groups that your tribe hang out in. Maybe make sure that it's in the media that your tribe consume. All of those things are very important. And making sure that really, you are seen as being a thought leader in the space. Make sure that you are seen as being somebody that wants your tribe to succeed. It's a super important thing. And that's something that we didn't have to worry about 10 or so years ago, but is now a really important part of moving podcasting forward. The one thing I would say, though, is that there is a lot of talk at the moment about video. As we record this, I've just been at a big announcement by Spotify, and they're talking about video and talking about all of the new and exciting things that they're going to be doing with video. And that's all great and lovely and everything else. But actually, you don't need to start with video. You don't even need video at all, to be honest, but you don't need to start with video. Start with audio. Make sure that you get the nuts and bolts of the show absolutely correct. If you want to add video later, then that's cool. You don't have to have video. You don't have to have video even to go on YouTube if you don't want to. But just start. That's the important thing. If you sit there and you go, well, I'm still not quite sure that I'm going to be doing this right, then you'll never start. So start and get better. That's what I would certainly say to everybody. You don't even need to tell people when you start if you don't want to. Only start telling people when you're comfortable about those shows that you've actually made. But the best way of becoming a great podcaster is to start.
Yes. I had a friend of mine who did exactly that. He told me, he's like, I'm starting a podcast, but don't tell anybody because I'm not telling anybody. Right now, I'm just recording these episodes and I don't have the pressure of them having to actually go out. And for him, that was a way to just start flexing the muscle, to start putting the reps in, to get started, and to feel more comfortable with the medium. And to your point, I mean, video, I know we're hearing so much about that right now. And there is just so much noise and confusion that's being created with this new edition of video podcasting, and people don't want to miss the boat. Yet going back to radio has done just fine for 100 years without video. Yes, you can watch the news on whatever news channel you want to get your news from, but you can also listen to the radio station, and plenty of people do and will continue to do so. And I think what you just said is so important for people to consider, to remember, and to really just take ownership of as they, go full into audio and then choose if it is for them or not to add video. And that is a perfect segue into what I am so excited to dig in with you in the next episode, James, which is to dive deeper into some of the predictions that you made about the podcasting industry earlier this year and talk about whether they've come true and what we can all expect in the year ahead. So thank you truly for all that you've given us to think about today, all the work that you do in the industry to help us stay on top of the changes and to stay ahead, because overall, it really is an encouraging and positive direction where we're headed.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
So don't go anywhere, because in the next episode, James is joining us back to unpack the biggest shifts that happened in podcasting this year and talk about the shifts that we can expect in the year ahead, including why downloads might not be the gold standard much longer, and how you can continue to stay ahead of the curve and adapt to the future of podcasting. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.